and welcome you all to Hebrew Story Hour. So we started with Genesis 12 and we're in Genesis 19. And if you have been here before, really happy that you're back. And if you haven't been here before, this is, I'll say a couple of things about how it works. I intentionally have this, intend this for you to be a low anxiety experience for you with language. I know if you've taken a Hebrew class or something, you get that pressure. I'll never ask you to read or parse or translate. I do all of that. But I hope that, if you have questions or if there's something to talk about, either Hebrew or exegesis wise, that we'll have some time for sure after I read the story to talk about it. So be kind of marking things in your mind as I read through it. I read about 3 or 4 or 5 verses and then translate it and then go right into the next one to give you a sense of the story. I've tried to moderate my reading pace so it sounds enough like a story, but it's not so fast that if you had a year of Hebrew, you can't kind of follow along. I don't know how successful I am with that, but that's the effort. So, and chapter 19, Genesis 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a long story. It's really a brilliant narrative, and there's a lot of particular repetitions and types of word plays and things that I'm excited to talk about together. So, anything I'm forgetting, Andrew, or anybody else who's been with anything I need to say? Okay. Well, if you have your Hebrew Bibles, you can follow along. And if not, you can listen along, but hopefully you have something in front of you that looks like Hebrew. All right. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. Genesis 19. Vayavo'u shnei hamalachim Sodoma ba'erev v'lot yoshev b'sha'ar Sodom vayar Lot vayakom vikratam vayishtachu apayim arza vayomer hine na Adonai suru na el beit avdechem Velinu v'rachatzu raglechem v'hishkamtem v'halachtem l'darkechem v'yomeru lo ki varachov nalim. Reading verse 3. Vayiftzar bam ma'od vayasuru elav vayavo'u el beito. Vaya'as lahem mishteh umatzot afa vayochelu. Okay, I'm pause there and go back and translate. Verse 1. And this is, I should have prefaced this with saying this is definitely picking up kind of on what we read last week in chapter 18. This narrative is tightly linked there. So we had 3 men at the beginning of 18. Now we have 2 of them who have gone on to Sodom. So the 2 messengers entered Sodom in the evening, and now Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom, and Lot saw and he got up to meet them, and he bowed face to the ground. You could say nose to the ground. Verse 2, and he said, "Look, my lords, turn to the house of your servant and stay or lodge and wash your feet, and then get up early and go on your way." And they said, "No, in the plaza we'll sleep." But he pressed them, and that word's going to come up again. He pressed them greatly. And they turned to him and And they turned to him, and they entered into his house. And he made for them a meal, and he baked unleavened bread, matzot, and they ate. Okay, verse 4. Terem ashkavu va'anshe ha'ir, anshe Sodom nasabu, al habayit, mina'ar va'ad zakein, kol ha'am mikatzeh. Vayikru el lot, vayomeru lo. Aye ha'anashim, asher ba'u elecha halayla. Hotziem eleinu, beneda otam. Verse 6. Vayetse alehem lot hapetecha, v'hadelet sagar acharav. 7. Vayomar al na achai tareu, hine na li shtevanot asher lo yadeu ish, otzia na et hen alechem, va'asu lahen katov be'enechem, rak la'anashim ha'el al ta'asu davar, ki al kain ba'u betzel korati. Okay, stopping there at the end of verse 8 and going back to translate in verse 4. Now, before they could lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, they surrounded the house, from the young one, the Na'ar, unto the Zakein, the old one, so young to old. All of the people, Mikatzeh could be either from every area, kind of Kates is the end, so from the ends of the city, or it could be sort of talking about another way of talking about to the very last one, kind of like everybody was there. Okay, verse 5. And they called out to Lot, and they said to him, where are the men who entered to you tonight, or who came to you tonight? Bring them to us, so that we might know them. Yada, of course, as a euphemism, a regular euphemism in the Hebrew Bible for sex. Okay, and verse 6. And he came out, Lot came out to them, to the opening. That's another word for the door, which this, by the way, I don't want to say too much yet, but relates to chapter 18. We have the whole curtain, the opening of the tent. Remind us to talk about that. So he came out to the opening, and he shut the door after him. And he said, no, my brothers, or rather, maybe, do not, my brothers, do harm, teiraut, or to do wickedness, to do evil. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you. And they, and you, well, and do to them what is good in your eyes, as you see fit. Only these men, to these men, do not do a thing, for they have come into the Sail Korati is the shadow of my roof. So they've come under the safety of my house, my roof. Okay, verse 9. Vayomeru gesh hala'a. Vayomeru he'echad ba lagur vayishpot shafot ata. Nara lecha mehem. Vayiftzeru va'ish belot ma'od. Vayigishu lishbor hadalet. Verse 10. Vayishluchu ha'anashim et yadam. Vayavi'u et lot alehem. Habayata. Ve'et hadelet sagaru. Verse 11. Ve'et ha'anashim asher petach habayit. Hiku basan ve'rim. Mikaton va'ad gadol. Vayilu limtso hapatach. Okay, and then translating back to 9, they said, this is a kind of a strange phrase, but it ends up being like move aside, but it's like draw near here or there. And they said, the one who has come to sojourn, so as a foreigner, as a sojourner, he has now played the judge. And I hope that I'm trying to convey the tone there. It's kind of some emphasis. Will he really play the judge? But it's a past tense. We will do more harm to you than to them. And they pressed on the man, onto Lot, greatly, ma'od. And they drew near to break down the door. In verse 10, and the men sent out their hand, and they brought Lot to them into the house, and they shut the door. In verse 11, and the men who were at the opening of the house, they struck with blindness, sanveirim, from the smallest to the biggest, or probably talking about age here, the youngest to the oldest. Perhaps also could be talking about status, katon and gadol. And la'ah is to weary or become sick or something. So they sickened to find, or they struggled perhaps to find the opening, patak, the door. All right, verse 12. We're going to read this whole chapter, by the way. I'm going to pause at the end of the story, but it's a long story, so hang with us. Verse 12. Vayomeru ha'anashim el lot od mi lecha fo chatan uvanecha uvenotecha v'chol asher lecha ba'ir hotse min hamakom. Verse 13, ki mashchitim anachnu et hamakom hazeh, ki gadla tza'akatam et penei Adonai, vayeshalechenu Adonai l'shachata. And verse 14, vayetze Lot vayedaber el chatanav, lo keche venotav, vayomer kumu tzu'u min hamakom hazeh, ki mashchit Adonai et ha'ir, vayehi chimtzachik be'enei chatanav. Okay, translating with verse 12. And the men said to Lot, who is still here with you, or who do you still have here? A son-in-law, or your sons, or your daughters, or anyone who belongs to you in the city? Bring them out from the place. Verse 13, because we are going to destroy this place, for their outcry is great against Yahweh. Peneh, or it could be before Yahweh. And they sent, and Yahweh has sent us to destroy it. In verse 14, and Lot went out, and he said to his sons-in-law, who were marrying or going to maybe betrothed to his daughters, and he said, get up, get out from this place, because Yahweh is destroying the city. but it was like a joke, or as joking in their eyes. Tzakak, right? Isaac laughing. We saw this in chapter 18. In the eyes of his sons-in-law, I should have said. Okay, verse 15. Uchamo hashachar Allah, v'ya'itzu hamalichim, v'lot lemor kum kach et ishtcha et shete v'notecha hanimtzaot, hen tisafe ba'avon ha'ir. Vayitmama vayachtsiku ha'anashim biyado uvayad ishto uvayad shete venotav v'chemlat Adonai alav vayotziuhu v'yanichuhu mechutz la'ir. 15. Okay, so as the dawn came up, the messengers urged or made hasten Itzu, Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters," and it's a nifal participle, who are found. It's interesting. Maybe we'll talk about that. But usually translated like "who are here," lest you be swept away in the sin of the city. But he dallied, he delayed, and the men grabbed his hand, and the hand of his wife, and the hand of his 2 daughters. But Chelmat is the compassion of Yahweh. So by the compassion of Yahweh upon him. And they brought him out, and they left him outside the city. Verse 17. Vayechi chehotziam otam hachutza vayomer himalet al nafshecha al tabit acharecha, ba'al ta'amod b'chol hikakar, hahara himalet pen tisapeh. Verse 18, Vayomer lot alehem, al na Adonai, hine na matza avdecha, chen ba'einecha, b'tagdel, chastecha asher asita imadi lahachayot et nafshi va'anochi lo uchal lehimalet hahara hen tidbakani hara'a vamati. Verse 20, hine na ha'ir hazot Kirova la nus shama behi mitzar imaleta na shama halo mitzar hi vatechi nafshi. Or sorry, utechi nafshi. Okay, back to 17. And as they when they brought them out to the outside, he said, "Flee or escape for yourself, or all nafshecha, for your life. Do not look behind you, and do not stand anywhere in the plain, or in all the plain. To the mountain flee, lest you be swept away." Verse 18, and Lot said to them, "No, my lords, look," or it could be, "No, my lord, no, my lords." We'll come back to that. "Look, your servant has found chen, favor in your eyes, and your chesed, your kindness, your steadfast love has been enlarged, or you have enlarged your chesed. You've made it great, which you have done with me, so that I might live, really, to keep my life alive. And I am not able, but as for me, I am not able to flee to the mountain, lest the evil, hara'ah, or the wickedness, cling to me, and I die, vamati. Verse 20, look, this city, Karov, this near city, to flee there. So he's asking for permission to flee to this city. And it's small, imtsar, or mitzar. Let me flee there. Is it not small? And my life will live. It's kind of jumbled, I think, but it's maybe not sensical. We can talk about that. Okay, we have a couple more sections. Verse 21. Vayomer elav, hine nasati fanecha gam ladavar hazeh, levilti hofki et ha'ir asher debarta. Verse 22. Maher himalet shama ki lo uchal la'asot davar ad boacha shama al kain kara shem ha'ir so'ar. Translate verse 21. And he said to him, look, I have lifted your face, right, which is an idiom for shown you favor. I've shown you favor also in this matter, ladavar hazeh, to not overthrow, so that I might not overthrow the city which you have spoken about which you have spoken. Hurry up, flee there, for I am not able to do a thing until you enter there. You're entering there. Therefore, he called the name of the city Soar. This is a play on the small one. And the sun came out upon the earth, and Lot entered Soar. Verse 24. Vadonai himtir al Sodom va'al Amorah gafarit va'esh me'et Adonai min hashamayim. Verse 25. V'yahafok et heharim ha'el ve'et kol hakikar ve'et kol yoshvei ha'ir v'tzemach ha'adamah. Verse 26. V'tabet ishto me'acharav v'atihi netziv melach. Okay, translating verse 24. And Yahweh made it rain. There's a fronting of the divine name here, but Yahweh made rain upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah. Gafrit is sulfur, and Aish, fire. From Yahweh, from the heavens. Verse 25, and he overturned the cities, or these cities. Ha'el is short for Ele, twice in this chapter. And all of the plain, the Jordan plain. And all of the inhabitants of the cities, and the sprout of the ground. So he's destroying the growth of the ground, this semach. Verse 26. And his wife looked behind him. And she, of course, became a pillar of salt. Okay, one more section, then we're going to stop and talk. We'll read through 28 here. Vayash came Avraham baboker El hamakom asher amad sham et pnei Adonai. Vayash kef al pnei Sodom ba'omorah. Ba'al kol pnei eretz hakikar. Bayar vahine. Allah kitor haaretz. Kukitor hakivshan. Okay, translating this. And Abraham got up early in the morning, and he stood, or to the place where he stood there. Maybe we decide to go to the place where he stood, or he stayed there. You don't need to translate sham. It's just he stood. It's resumptive before the Lord, and he looked out upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and upon all of the land of the plain. And he saw and look, or behold, a smoking came up from the earth like the smoke of the kiln. Okay. Hopefully you are getting something from that, quite a bit to talk about. And of course, the story really does continue, but I think that's a good stopping place to talk. So what questions or observations did you make as we work through chapter 19 so far?
I noted that every time we have Yahweh, you read it Adonai, but you translated Yahweh.
Yeah, I do that kind of without thinking, but it's according to a tradition as far as reading that the word is pointed with, of course, the vowels for the word Adonai, even with the tetragrammaton, the divine name. So the Masoretic tradition, which is picking up on a much earlier tradition, is to, when you see the divine name, to say Adonai. And so our English, almost all English traditions or translations will do that as well, and do Lord in all caps as a way of trying to represent that. And I do it without thinking to say Yahweh, because I think it's partly important for us to know that this is a real name and not just a title. So it's like we need to, on the one hand, maintain the tradition of respect for the divine name. On the other hand, I think we need to recover the name a bit and to know it's kind of the importance of the God giving his personal name.
You commented somewhere early on about the door, the opening. I didn't know if you were talking delet or patach.
But it's kind of one and the same, but patach in particular, especially so if you remember in chapter 18, right, think about how people are aligned. You have the three men who are sitting at a meal outside the tent. Abraham is between them and the tent. Sarah is in the tent at the opening of the tent, right? And then you have this kind of dialogue. Abraham's like a mediator, but really the message, Yahweh is speaking to Sarah, who's listening at the opening of the tent. And it just seemed, it's hard to know what to make of all of this, like the theological significance. It's just that the dynamic between that, I think we're definitely supposed to compare Abraham's hospitality and the event in chapter 18 with Lot's hospitality and the events in 19, where you have tents in 18, you have a house, kind of city life in 19, you have the messengers inside the house in this case, and Lot sort of as a mediator with the angry mob. So, and there's several other parallels and points of comparison, the food that they serve, and there's some similarities and there's also differences. So I think it's mostly kind of the opening, mostly just a kind of a narrative marker, like, hey, this is, it shows the similarities between 18 and 19, but there's something about thresholds, about movement inside and outside spaces that is a regular motif in narratives, not just biblical narratives, but when you move into a space of security, in this case, inside the house, and there's danger outside the house, and kind of what happens right at the door. There's so much action. He steps out, shuts the door, he steps in, here they grab him, they bring him inside. And so that to me, that's significant. There may be more significance to it than even what I've said, but at least in a narrative sense, I think the opening is a place where all the action's happening. There are questions. Yeah, go ahead, Logan.
The first word in verse 16, vayit mama. Is there built into that word like a reason why he lingered? Was it lack of faith? Was he collecting his stuff? Do you know?
Yeah, the word itself won't tell us that. It tells us, it's a weird word, by the way, to get grammatical for us here. It's from maha, so it's a geminative verb, mem, hey. So we have this reduplication. It doesn't occur very many times. I did look it up beforehand to see about like where else it occurred. I think it occurs one other time in Genesis. The word itself, I don't think tells us anything about why he's delaying, but I think we can infer potentially some things about character, potentially, or from the broader context. I've seen two ideas. One is that it could be Lot's kind of lack of faith in the sense he's not hurrying out of there. I was reading in Klaus Westermann's commentary. He thinks it's not that. He thinks it's a commentary on kind of city life where, there's this, and this is built into this whole story. We have the gates at the very beginning where Lot is hanging out, and then the door and the shadow of his roof, the shade. Security is such a big deal where he tends to have a false sense of security that's associated with the city. So he's just not in any big hurry. He's going to leave, but I don't know. It's one of those things, and like in so many of the Genesis narratives, we have to, the narrator doesn't tell us, kind of what's going on within Lot. We have to discern that on the basis of the story itself. Now, perhaps there's some ideas on that particular issue. Ethan?
Well, do you think that kind of fits within when he and Abram have the conflict about?
I think Ethan froze. I think I know what he's going to say, but I don't want to. I'll give him a chance to come back. I'll guess what Ethan's going to say, and then he'll correct me. That when they choose the land, I don't know. Maybe this is a wrong. Maybe we'll come back to Ethan when he stops freezing, and just let him ask his question for himself. Are you there, Ethan? Okay, you're back.
Okay, sorry.
Try again.
What did you hear? Okay. Going back to where Abram and Lot have the conflict about which way are they going to go, and Lot chooses Sodom and Gomorrah. I was trying to ask, it seems to fit within that mindset of this looks like the more secure, fertile, fruitful area. Right. So that's why I'm going this way. And could you comment on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that narrative is tied to this. There does seem to be something of, I don't think this necessarily runs throughout the Hebrew Bible, but in these Genesis narratives, there's a kind of nomad tent dwelling versus city dwelling, kind of a commentary on urban life. Now we have to remember, like, these are very small cities by any measure that we know, but still the security and like how things look on the surface. And I think you're right to mention kind of the fruitfulness of the land. people become, it seems like the story is saying something about, not that, yeah, maybe Lot made a wrong choice. I think in that story itself, it doesn't seem to appear to be a bad choice. It just seems to be the obvious choice. But then it's sort of flipped on its head because he's not thinking about the character of the people. There's definitely a relationship there. I don't know if I would go so far as to say there's kind of an anti-urban bias in the Genesis stories, but there are several places where the city itself is a symbol for chaos-ish, or just harm and wickedness. And that's combined with a false sense of security. You know, we build our walls, we build our houses. Yeah, we've got a civilization and so on. And obviously, this is an extremely wicked people. I saw Bleddy, I think you had a hand up earlier. You might have made a comment that I missed, but go ahead if you have.
My comment is I can see that lingering from his part in view of Genesis 13, but could it be that Moses is preparing us for his wife looking back and turning into a statue of salt next to it? Is like, it's not only her, it's the same thing with Lot. And his hesitation could be, put me here at this little city before moving farther.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. You said Moses. Moses' wife is not going to turn into a pillar of salt, but
no, I said Moses, meaning Moses is the author of Genesis.
Okay. Yeah, I was saying, yeah, I think a really strange part. It's almost, when you read this narrative, it's like, oh yeah, and his wife looked back behind him, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Some would explain that as an etiological element. What I mean by that is that this story is written in order to explain, like we're talking about the Dead Sea area, and it's just destitute, right? And if you actually go there, you see these kind of salt pillars and so on, and a story that would explain how they got to be there and so on. I think there's more to the narrative than just etiology, just explaining the Dead Sea, the kind of the infertility of that area. It is interesting, like Lot is obviously the main character with the messengers, but you have his daughters who will become a much more significant, and you have his wife, and you have his sons-in-law, sort of all these people who belong to Lot's circles, and they're following more than the others in the city, but they have to physically grab them by the hands, right? Take them away. I think there is something kind of looking back where they made their home or something, doesn't really go on to explain, like, why does she look back? Or, it's just, so it's kind of open for, I think, reading into, not in a wrong way, but her character from that. David?
I had a question. Yeah, I was just wondering if the ancient readers of this text would be as abhorred as we would with Lot offering his daughters, or is that what they would think should happen given the expectations of hospitality? I mean, it seems horrific either way, but I just wonder what can we say about Lot's character regarding that incident?
Yeah, I have an idea, but let me see what you guys think. It's a good question, because I think you're right. There's obviously cultural conventions here of hospitality and so on, but what if we could answer that on the basis of any textual clues? What do you think? Is Lot, are we supposed to understand Lot as just in this kind of, like, how could he possibly offer up his daughters? What are we supposed to see in this? in his character from this.
So this may or may not answer the question, but I often tie this Genesis 19 over to Judges 19.
Yeah.
There are very, very parallel stories because at that season, it's in the cities of the tribes of Benjamin, and they get abhorred that it's like, these things have not happened in Israel. They don't happen among our people, but they've come to a point of such immorality and so forth that even these things are happening. And so in that story, I don't even think he's named, but the guy offers up his concubine. And of course, they take the concubine and do whatever they do to her all night until in the morning she's holding on to the threshold dead. And he's like, get up, let's go. And it's like, she came back to this figurative place of safety, and you were unable or unwilling to try to protect her. And you offered her up to whatever these people were going to do, and they killed her. And this again, the patach, the opening the door of the, where it's like the transition between safety and security versus danger or what have you. She's holding on to the threshold, and there was no safety to be had. And it was amongst the people of God, supposedly, that those things were happening instead of the heathens of Sodom or what have you.
Right.
So I don't know that answers the question, but it's a parallel story that I think is worth considering in light of this one.
Yeah, it's definitely an important parallel. In fact, that's one of Westermann makes a big, he has pages about the parallels between those stories. So you're right on with looking at even at the structure of the stories and so on. And in that story, like this one, it's clear that you have pure wickedness among, like in this story, the people of Sodom, the men of Sodom. And from those who mistreat the concubine. But what about the Levite? And what about Lot, right? On the one hand, the story doesn't really call what he does wicked. He seems like forced into it. And I think in both stories in some ways, although there are clearly I think the story that follows in chapter 19 is some kind of comment on Lot's status, where his daughters will take advantage of him, just like he's willing to kind of just use them. They're going to use him. And clearly that's not a life of kind of the faithfulness that you see like in the model of Abraham, let's say, where he's trusting in God's promise, or at least in some stories, for God's going to protect him. God's going to come through. Like perhaps what Lot should do is trust in the guys who are staying with him, but he does want to protect, like his motive seems to be to protect the malachim, the messengers. Yeah, maybe there's further comment on David's question.
This seems upside down to our modern perspective, but if 150 years in American culture, hospitality was a much, much more important attribute or character indicator than it is today. And I see part of this as a struggle between Lot's desire to provide hospitality versus protection of his daughters that in some sense he had already pledged to men of the city.
Yeah.
Now, there's some differences between how they would be handled, certainly, but I see this as an ethical struggle between two things. When he doesn't have the courage to simply say no.
Yeah, I think that's well put. You're right. Hospitality has changed in our own culture quite a bit in relatively recent history. And hospitality is clearly an important thing. Like in these, and again, I think the best way to get at this is to compare 18 and 19. So Abraham is hurrying around in chapter 18. You know, he downplays what he's going to give them, and then he gives this kind of overwhelming feast of, you know, of meat. And he's got a calf involved, so they're cooking, they're kneading bread, and so on. And then Lot is also hurrying and seems have a real concern with their safety. Don't sleep in the gate. Come over and sleep in my house. And he makes a meal and he cooks unleavened bread, which perhaps we're supposed to compare sort of the quick bread with the long meal and so on we have in chapter 18. So he's still being hospitable. It's interesting that the men in chapter 18 accept Abraham's request to stop and stay with him right away. But here they sort of said, no, we'll sleep in the plaza. And he said, oh, don't do that. And then they give in. And he presses them. Samuel just opened up. I'm just kind of talking through it, but you have this word, parats, to press them. And then later the men are pressing, same word, men are pressing Lot at the household up against. So anyway, that's a different word than Abraham uses to kind of persuade them, to kind of urge them to stay with him. I don't think Lot comes off well in this story. I mean, he is not this is a symbolic story for the wickedness of the city. And Sodom and Gomorrah come up over and over in the Hebrew Bible as a trope for God punishes evil. But Lot, it never comes off as well as Abraham. And that's kind of the regular comparison. And God still spares him. So he must be, maybe for the sake of Abraham, but you have this whole story of, can I find 50? Can I find 45? Can I find 40? All the way, can I find 10 righteous people? And ends up just being Lot and his daughters and his wife. So yeah, I don't think we're supposed to just kind of say, well, Lot's just being hospitable by convention. He's doing what he ought to according to the conventions of hospitality. He's thinking about his own security. He's thinking about his guest security over his daughter's security. And it's interesting, he's calling the people of Sodom brothers. No, my brothers. He's trying to appeal to their equity. And they call him a sojourner. You're just you're echad lagur. You're sojourning among, you're not among it. And he's going to come and judge us, It's just Lot seems to want to be one with the city and the people of the city. And he's just trying to kind of play their game. And that seems to be his downfall and what we ought to be critical of Lot for, to read this. That was rather lengthy to take on all the bigger issue here. Maybe there's a little more discussion. We're coming up against our hour, and this is I've never not made it through a chapter, but I think it's appropriate to probably stop here. Part of me really wants to read the next narrative about Lot ends up going to the mountain, even though he wants to go to this little town. And that's kind of a strange part of this narrative. Just send me to that little town over there. He just wants to stay in the city so badly. And then he, well, even what we read says, he says, the evil will cling to him if he goes to the mountain, and I'll die. It's he's just all about his own security.
Can I ask about this shadow? Whenever you read, I guess in English it's always, they've come under the protection of my roof, my house. But the Hebrew says under the shadow of my roof. And there was something about that idea of the shadow that I started thinking about, how many times the psalmists will say that God has them under the shadow of his wings. And how there's this idea of taking refuge under the shadow of his wings, and that symbol of protection and shield, if you will, that's there. And I can't help but see the idea of the shadow of your roof. It's like, once you're under the shadow of my roof, it's like you're under my protection. There's kind of a similar, I don't know what the motif perhaps, but
Yeah.
anyway, what do you think on that idea?
You're right. The shadow of God's wings is a regular motif. It is a motif, phrase, poetic image for God's protection, and refuge is such an important theme in the Psalms. I don't know how much to make of it here. Sale, well, you know what? I hadn't thought about this for now, but I'm just doing all this 18 and 19 comparison. You'll remember that Abraham invites the men to sit in the shadow of the tree. They're in the heat of the day to rest in the shade. And so it's probably the most I would probably make of it is to say, oh, it's another comparison. But instead of the tree, where the oak trees where Abraham hangs out, it's under his roof. So it's probably more of kind of a literary narrative connection with the previous story than it is kind of tapping into this kind of bigger metaphor of the shadow of the roof rather than the shadow of God's wing or something like this. But that does come to my mind as well, Dustin, because that's such a regular, that sail knafe, the wings of God, which is, a bird metaphor. But I hadn't thought about the connection. I really like the connection with chapter 18 with the shade is relief and protection. Good. Other questions or observations?
The word hospitality was mentioned earlier. I know that there is an attempt to read into Sodom and Gomorrah in view of LGBTs, and the sin being lack of hospitality. And we know Ezekiel connects it with pride. But where's the point where we are careful not to read too much into this idea of hospitality in this text?
Yeah, I mean, we could probably talk about this for a while. It's a great question. I do think hospitality, there's a lot of sin. That's an avon. There, he's going to just destroy the whole place and the land because of the avon of the city, Ha'ir, as a whole. And it's really important in this story that from the youngest to oldest, it's trying to portray the city with no gray area. They're completely wicked. And that's important for just the theodicy issues, God's justice, and so on. But hospitality is part of that. And so I don't think it's an either or. Like the sin of Sodom is, yes, they are doing the exact opposite of what they ought to be doing in showing hospitality and showing protecting and welcoming, these men by seeking to rape them. Right? I mean, that's so it's still a hospitality issue. And I don't think this applies very well to sort of contemporary LGBTQ issues. It perhaps very marginally because it involves sodomy, right? Where we get this whole thing, but it is violent rape, abuse, and what Lot offers up about his daughters is equally abusive. But I would say under the umbrella of hospitality, their wickedness is typified by their desire to rape the visitors. So it is not a text. I don't think it's a text to like critique homosexuality. It's just in this story, homosexual rape is the antithesis of the hospitality that they ought to be showing, of righteousness. Maybe there's another comment or two on that, because clearly that's an important, that's the most of the world knows this story because of that issue. Well, if not, that's okay. We are at the end of our Hebrew story hour. Next week we'll pick up with verse 29, and we will probably do 20. It's not a real long chapter. I'm just gonna, 2 weeks from now, we will not be meeting. If you're a planner, that's the day before Thanksgiving, and I'll have a house full of people and so on. So we can read Hebrew on our own, but we'll be back the week after that. If you're not a part of I did start a Facebook group. If you're on Facebook and you want to keep up with Hebrew Story Hour, get kind of updates and latest announcements, look for Hebrew Story Hour on Facebook, the group, and it's public, and you're certainly invited to join and invite others who you think might benefit from or enjoy something like this. All right, I'm going to hang out for a few minutes if you want to talk. Otherwise, this concludes the Hebrew Story Hour for today. Adonai imachem.